Today we'll discuss how the United Nations system responds to widespread or mass human rights violations and atrocities. This is the principle known as humanitarian intervention. We'll discuss this issue in two lectures, today with an introduction to humanitarian intervention and a discussion of intervention's rules and restrictions under the United Nations Charter, in particular the rules regarding multilateral and unilateral intervention and their application in practice. The next lecture considers an emerging legal doctrine known as the responsibility to protect. Here you'll see a basic definition of humanitarian intervention. This is intervention that involves the use of military force for the purpose of either preventing or ending widespread human rights abuses and humanitarian crises in another country. And if you think about it for a moment, this is a very different sort of international mechanism than the ones we've studied earlier this week. Those all involve international institutions engaging in monitoring and review of individual state parties' conduct and using the tools of persuasion and naming and shaming in order to try to change states' behavior. Here you see the resort is to actual military force to coerce or compel the state to change or remedy its conduct. So the overarching question that we'll need to consider in thinking about humanitarian intervention is under what circumstances may states lawfully engage in this activity in order to prevent widespread or mass human rights violations in another country. And you can imagine right away that we could be facing situations where humanitarian intervention might seem to be a very good idea to certain groups or certain states, but a very bad idea to others, in part because of the dangers or risks that it might be abused or used as a pretext, or that the scale of the intervention might not be commensurate with the scope of the violations. So when it comes to using military force as a tool of enforcing international law and enforcing international norms, that obviously raises quite a few challenges. Now, the United Nations has a number of rules dealing with the use of force. Indeed, I think it would be fair to say that these rules are really at the heart of the United Nations Charter and its collective security system. And I want to walk you through some of those key rules so that we can then assess the traditional approach to humanitarian intervention under the UN Charter and some of the challenges that that approach raised. Here you will see a reference to two provisions of the UN Charter, Article 2.7 and Article 39. Article 2.7 establishes the proposition that the United Nations does not intervene in matters that are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of any state. So the United Nations deals with international matters, not domestic matters. Of course, that raises a very interesting question about matters that are both international and domestic. And that's one that we have been discussing for the last few lectures and will continue to discuss. For now, though, I want to emphasize the fact that there is an institutional mechanism in the Charter that allows for dealing with these boundary crossing types of cases, if you will. And that is in the last line of Article 2.7, which says that this particular domestic jurisdiction principle doesn't prejudice the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7 of the Charter. And Chapter 7 is the provision that gives to the United Nations Security Council the authority to determine and respond to any threat to or breach of the peace or act of aggression, and to decide how to respond, and indeed how to authorize, and in some instances require, member states to respond as well. Understanding the Council's role, of course, requires you to understand something about its membership and voting rules. These may already be familiar to many of you, so I'll just run through them very quickly. The Council is comprised of 15 UN member states, 5 of permanent members, who you see on the screen, the so-called P5, and 10 members who rotate geographically distributed according to region, and they serve for 2-year terms. Now, in order for the UN Security Council to take substantive action relating to authorizing the use of force, a vote of at least 9 members of the Council is required, and the concurring votes of all of the P5. And that has been interpreted over decades as meaning either the affirmative vote of the P5 or an abstention. And it follows from that voting rule that any member of the P5 can veto a resolution. So what sort of actions can the Council take with respect to threats or breaches to the peace in order to authorize humanitarian intervention? Well, here you see references to 2 articles of the Charter that allow for both measures not involving the use of armed force. These could be economic sanctions, diplomatic restrictions, travel bans, asset freezes, etc., as well as in Article 42, the reference to the use of military force in a variety of different guises. It is the Security Council itself that makes these determinations. Individual UN member states are prohibited from engaging in the threat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state. And so here is a ban, essentially, on unilateral use of force to couple with the authorization for multilateral uses of force that survive the procedural and substantive rules of the UN Charter via the activities of the Security Council. So what does this mean in practice regarding views about humanitarian intervention? And the traditional rule was, and I think it's fair to say still is, that only the Security Council can authorize humanitarian intervention. Unilateral or regional intervention without such authorization is illegal under international law, even if it is used against a state that is engaging in or on the verge of engaging in massive and egregious violations of internationally protected human rights. As you can imagine, this rule gives the Security Council an enormous amount of power, and in particular it gives every member of the P5 the ability to limit authorizations for the use of force if in its national or political interest it were to determine that the authorization to use such force was problematic. So one question that I want to raise with you is what justifies the traditional view in light of the fact that it is essentially stacked against intervention because of the possibilities of vetoes or the possibility of not getting a supermajority of the Council to vote in favor of intervention. And I would say that, as I mentioned briefly earlier, the concern about pretext, that a intervention might be used as a ruse or in order to obtain other goals, such as the acquisition of territory, control over natural resources, political domination, and Security Council authorization with the voting requirements I've described to you deters such pretextual interventions. But it also, I think, deters mixed motive interventions, and perhaps that's a good thing. But it might, in addition, also go further and prevent the possibility of humanitarian intervention when it really was justified and needed. And as you can see from this slide, it was the case that during the Cold War, when the USSR and the US were both members of the Council, there were really almost no multilateral interventions because of vetoes or veto threats from either of those two P5 members. Now, this situation continued for several decades until the early 1990s, at the time of the breakup of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. And during the decade of the 1990s, there were quite a few humanitarian crises in different regions of the world. I've listed some of them on the slide before you. And this created, if you will, a growing demand for humanitarian intervention. That is, the different communities in which these crises were occurring themselves wanted some sort of military force, or some group within the state did, in order to prevent human rights abuses. And there was a widespread belief that that would be an appropriate function of the United Nations. Now, the question, of course, that's raised is the traditional view about humanitarian intervention sufficient or adequate to respond to these challenges? And that's an issue we will take up in the next lecture. I will leave you with this slide, which shows a number of additional sources that discuss the various principles of humanitarian intervention.